Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And today, I'm pleased to welcome back for his second appearance on the Power Hungry Podcast, the famed green chicken, Doomberg. Welcome back.
Robert, great to be here. Loved my first appearance. Loving your work, watching you grow. Congratulations on the launch of your Substack. Everybody listening should go over and sign up. It's fantastic stuff. Love your work. And when you reached out to come back on, it was a complete no-brainer. Looking forward to a great discussion.
Well, thanks. There is much to discuss, and I've been reading over the transcript of our first talk now, which was May 27th of last year. A lot has happened since then. We've seen the European energy market go nuts. TTF selling for $100 per MMBTU in the Dutch trading hub. Now it's back under $20. Fertilizer shutdowns in Europe. Now it seems like that fertilizer market has kind of recovered. Coal prices went over 400. They've come back down. There's a lot going on. Bring us up to speed now. I mean, in terms of kind of the gyrations that we've seen over the last few months, and how do you make sense of this? Is this the quiet before another storm? How do you see what's going on?
So a couple of things. You've characterized the situation correctly, as usual. The primary thing that happened was Germany and particular, but Western Europe in general, went into the winter seeking to acquire every BTU of energy they could, regardless of price and, importantly, regardless of carbon footprint. For a good while there, coal was actually selling on a BTU basis for a higher price than oil, which is sort of a totally unheard of first time in history event, which told you that there was a mad scramble for primary BTUs. And coal, when primary BTUs are the main product, coal has some advantages. It's a solid. You could store it in a big pile next to your power plant. And then two other things happened. Germany did a miraculous job of bringing back on 16 gigawatts of coal power, far more than the market anticipated was possible. And most importantly, it has been an incredibly unseasonably warm winter in Germany. And thank God it has been. Contrary to what some trolls on Twitter might suspect, we weren't sitting here cheering for catastrophically cold weather and validation of our concerns about the European energy policy in the form of a true crisis for the population of Europe. I think the fact that they dodged this bullet, I hope that they don't learn all the wrong lessons from it, although it seems like they are primed to do so. But by and large, Germany did a great job of bringing coal back on. At one point last week, when we last wrote about this subject, some 45% of the electricity was coming from the burning of coal. Germany has one of the brownest grids in Western Europe, despite having one of the largest penetrations of solar and wind, which, as you know, and have documented and others have observed, this is pretty common, and so they made a mad dash back to the coal mines. We said in a piece that we wrote recently, the speed and efficiency with which Germany retreated to the coal mines was on par with the British evacuation from Dunkirk. And they did what they had to do.
Built incredibly rapid construction of the LNG receiving terminal as well, which was done in 120 days or something. It was incredible how quickly they built that LNG plant or LNG receiving terminal as well.
Yeah, what they did was they built the pipelines needed to receive it. It was a floating terminal that was already construction. But to be clear, when push came to shove, the red tape was cut aside. And they made a mad scramble back to natural gas, coal. And thank God they kept their nuclear power plants on, because during the doldrums of Germany, nuclear was producing more energy than wind and solar combined. If we said in a piece, if Greta had gotten her way, the piece was, I believe it was called Mission Impossible. If Greta had gotten her way and they had shut down all of their coal plants, where would Germany be today if they hadn't reopened them? And so, and on top of all of that, Robert, they spent $500 billion doing it. And so that $500 billion could have bought them a lifetime supply of nuclear power plants for a whole generation. And instead they wasted it really on 1 year's worth of oil, coal, and natural gas. They raised the price of coal for everyone else in the world. They raised the price of LNG for everyone else in the world. Pakistan is in the midst of a historic energy blackout right now because they were unable to acquire the incremental cargoes of LNG, as we all predicted. So that they managed to get as much coal back online as they did, and that the winter has been incredibly warm, are not validations of the soundness of German energy policy or evidence of our sort of alarmism in pointing out that this was a catastrophe that could happen. I think, in fact, they're pretty strong evidence that if you screw up your energy policy, you have a huge price to pay, both financially and geopolitically, and ultimately, for the less fortunate few in the world who couldn't compete for the market clearing price of all the BTUs that the Germans and the Western Europeans had to acquire ahead of this winter.
It's just this, what is it? Malthusianism in the market, right? Or not Malthusianism. I'm sorry, Machiavellian energy policy. That we're going to outbid you, screw you, and that's effectively what they've done relative to Bangladesh and Pakistan. Is that? I'm paraphrasing what you're saying.
Sure,
and
right? They sacrificed their industrial strength as well. It's very hard to compete when you're paying the highest price possible for the incremental BTU that feeds your manufacturing sector. And so Germany, which before the energy crisis evolved and then the war in Ukraine exacerbated it, Germany was known as a high value add manufacturing economy that leveraged cheap natural gas and domestic coal. And they've returned back to coal. I mean, so with natural gas less of an option via pipeline, they brought it in via LNG, and they bought as much coal as they could. They kept their 3 nuclear power plants running. We'll see. They have another decision to make here in April. They'd be awfully foolish to shut those off, but I suspect that the German Greens will view the lack of a catastrophe as proof of the soundness of their policy, and they will make a renewed push to shut those power plants down. And if they do, it'd be hard to feel sorry for them next winter if things don't turn out to be quite so warm.
Well, let's talk about next winter, because that has been in the background here, as you point out, the warm winter and these other things that have helped maybe delay the crisis in Europe. But let's look to 11 months from now. Where is Europe simply going to have to be locked into the global LNG market and therefore be paying substantially higher prices than they were for Russian pipeline gas? What happens next year?
Well, I think, first of all, a lot of it depends on how and whether there's a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. And we're beginning to see some overtures, of course, immediately denied by the Biden administration, that there might be some calls for peace. We would certainly be pro-peace. I'm old enough to remember when being anti-war and pro-peace was considered liberal, not alt-right wing as it is now. Right. And even today, even though natural gas has sort of fallen off a cliff, natural gas in Europe, the Dutch TTF contract is $18.50, $19 per million BTU. Interestingly, the ratio of natural gas in Europe to the US has remained stubbornly flat in this sort of 6 to 9x. So literally, even though it's come down in Europe, they're still paying 6 to 9 times what domestic manufacturers in the Gulf Coast of the US or in Alberta are paying for natural gas, which gives them a huge competitive advantage.
So you're saying that's the delta between Henry Hub and the TTF price?
The ratio, actually,
right.
Not the delta.
Okay, yeah. The ratio between them. Yeah, okay.
18.5 divided by 2 and change is still 6 to 7, right?
Right,
and
yeah,
so,
gotcha.
And that at the peak of the crisis, it was a little higher than that. You mentioned that TTF touched intraday 100, and I think we were probably around 10 here on the domestic front back then, which was a crisis for Biden, by the way. I mean, going from historically 2.5 pre-crisis to 10 is going to result in a lot of annoyed voters just ahead of the midterms. And so he did everything he could correctly to make sure that we had domestic supply ahead of this winter. We have plenty. We ourselves have had a very unseasonably warm winter. I posted on Twitter that New York, the daily highs in New York routinely pierced the 90th percentile in the month of January, and the daily lows were hovering around the average daily highs historically. This great website that we quote this data from. And look, New England is going through a real cold snap this weekend. We're hearing rumblings already of a few rolling power outages, which we probably won't see too much in the way of news reporting unless it gets very serious. We hope it doesn't. Again, we're not here cheering for calamity. But ISO New England is basically running the German experiment, running the California experiment, except unlike California, they actually have a winter. And so that we'll see how much oil they'll be burning this weekend to barely keep the lights on once again. And they've been busily shutting down nuclear power plants and postponing or abrupting or shutting down natural gas pipelines, all the same shenanigans that we see in Germany. It is amazing, Robert. I wonder how many more data points will these people need to see before they reconsider the basis of their sort of policy. It's really crazy.
It is. ISO New England is remarkable. That well, on part of it, they can blame, I suppose, part of it on New York, by New York's efforts to block gas pipelines that would take Marcellus gas further north and into New England. But it is amazing, and it's harkens back to the '70s, where the grid was so dependent on burning fuel oil, and for power production. That's what ISO New England is doing. That's how they're keeping their grid afloat, is through liquid hydrocarbons and using those in their generation plants. And I don't know. I mean, this is supposedly one of the most liberal area. It is one of the most liberal voting blocks in all of the U.S. Right, a heavily Democratic region, and all about climate change and reducing emissions and renewables and the rest of it. And yet, look at their grid; it's a total mess, continually teetering on the precipice of blackouts, and they're burning oil, which produces not quite twice as much, or about a third more CO2 emissions than natural gas. None of it makes any sense.
Well, there's far better uses for oil than to burn it to produce electricity. Natural gas is a far superior fuel for burning to produce electricity. Nuclear power, as I'm sure you know. And look, to ISO New England, the organization's credit, they have been ringing this bell for a long time. This is not their fault.
Right.
They can only react to what the politicians give them. This is not an ISO New England crisis. This is a New England political crisis, a crisis of ignorance, actually, a crisis of anti-science. And, every time one of these cold snap happens and nothing big, transpires, they just keep rolling the dice. And so eventually, unfortunately, there will have to be some amount of pain felt by some amount of people, a certain critical mass, before a reconsideration of the policies is mandated by the voters. Now, to Joe Biden's credit, he didn't want high natural gas prices in the U.S. and he didn't want high gasoline prices in the U.S. And he did everything he could in 2022 to bring those prices down, contrary to the wishes of the environmentalists, because, low prices stokes demand. Demand means more CO2 emissions, yada, yada, yada. Biden understood politically that $5 gasoline and $10 per million BTU natural gas was going to mean a wipeout in the midterms. 1 million barrels a day from the SPR was released. The Freeport explosion of the LNG export terminal was kind of slow rolled back into production. Wink, wink, everybody smiles. We trap a lot of gas domestically. U.S. natural gas back down to $2. Oil, $3.50 gasoline across the country is tolerable. He knew, he's an old school politician. He knows where the threats really are, but the environmentalists probably can't be too happy with him.
Although they still seem to be firmly in control of energy policy in this administration. And you have that great line, but in the battle between physics and platitudes, physics remains undefeated, which has kind of become one of your trademark lines here. It's one of the questions I've written down. I was going to ask it later, but what is it that there's this disconnect, it seems to me, fundamentally in between the parties. And the Wall Street Journal had a very good piece about this. It was Gerald Baker, I think, had a piece in the Journal, I think it was a week ago, and talking about how the Republican Party has become the party of the working class. That among white, non-college educated males, they're overwhelmingly voting for Republicans. And that the Democrats and the Republicans, the Democrats have fashioned themselves for years as being the party of the working class, and yet when it comes to energy, that seems to be completely lost. Is that your read? How do you see the political divide on that?
Yeah, so I think Joe Biden has tried to have a foot in both camps. Again, when you're 40 years in D.C., you become skilled at survival more than anything else. And he plays footsie with the environmentalists, and he certainly gives them all kinds of candy in the environment, the Inflation Reduction Act and so on. But there's some things in the Inflation Reduction Act also for carbon capture and sequestration at natural gas plants, a piece we wrote about the Rice family's endeavors with this net power, embedded carbon capture in a natural gas power plant. And if their technology works, and I hope it does, and I wish the Rice family well, they've got a great track record of creating value for their shareholders. They were kind enough to make the CEO of the new company available for an interview for us, which was great for an alternative media site like ours. That always means a lot. Biden cut deals with Manchin, whatever you think of him. Biden understands that he will not succeed politically with gas at the pump above $5 a gallon and natural gas above 10, and did what he had to do. At the same time, we've been watching the solar situation work out, as we've written about a lot, which is, They're against slave labor, which we all should be. At the same time, they're pro solar installations, and yet we make nothing here because we ceded the entire manufacturing sector to China. And we have all of these solar panels piling up at customs because we're enforcing our anti-slave labor laws at the same time that we're reducing demand for solar via all of the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. We wrote a piece many months ago called Solar Zugzwang. Something has to give. Like you can't both be opposed to slave labor, understand that China controls 98% of polysilicon ignition and wafering, and then still expect to stoke significant demand for solar domestically in the U.S. without having a local domestic manufacturing capability.
Right.
And so there's a lot of bipolarity in the Democratic White House, the administration, and that's driven by Biden's visceral understanding of how retail politics works, which has been finely tuned over 40 years. At the same time, with his need to placate the sort of extremists in his progressive environmental base. And that's how you get sort of these mixed signals. Look, if you're an environmentalist, what justification can you ascribe to Biden releasing 1 million barrels a day of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve?
Right.
Thereby reducing the cost of oil, and by definition, economics 101, increasing demand. The decision to release 1 million barrels a day of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was probably at the margins accountable for more incremental CO2 emissions than any other policy the administration put into place last year.
Well, and they'd had the double impact of really effectively screwing domestic producers, right? Because that takes 1 million barrels of demand away from their potential market, right? So, and maybe that is the double. Maybe that is.
But those same producers have been producing record profits because if they hadn't done that, oil would have been 150.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's the remarkable thing. I've talked to I know a few people in the oil patch, and they said, we're making more money than we ever have. Which is really, I don't know if irony is the right word, but it's one of the facts in play here that they are doing remarkably well.
Well, let's be clear too, to the OPEC producing nations and the domestic big oil producers, $80 to $90 Brent, $80 to $90 WTI is right down the middle in the sweet spot for them.
Yeah.
It's high enough that they can print cash, but not so obscene that you have a political revolt. They don't want $150 oil.
Right.
They don't want $300 oil. They might benefit from it in the short term, but these companies, as you know, tend to take longer term time horizons. It's a capital intense industry. You have to, the conservative nature of the long-term pricing forecast when they make these $billion decisions and the net present value calculations they have to make, they're not modeling in $80 a barrel right now. They're modeling $45, $50, $60 a barrel with downside risk.
Right.
And so if you could price out $80 a barrel for the next 3 years, there's not an oil producer in the world that wouldn't walk over tax to take that deal. Sure. And so in a way, Biden has sort of stabilized the price at $80 a barrel, which has been a boon for these producers.
Yeah. Well, let's switch back to what you've been focusing on. I mean, you mentioned several of the pieces you've written recently, and you have one just, I think, today, or I think it was out today, about AMC Theaters and the shenanigans of the company's CEO, Adam Aron. You've written recently on deep sea mining. You've written on crypto. You've written on natural gas stoves. We talked about, energy. And so what makes a Doombergable article? I mean, you obviously have a very wide range here, and I'm interested in a lot of things, and I have the attention span of a fruit fly. I want to write about everything. What is it that in this massive data stream that you're dealing with and trying to make sense of, as we all are, how do you decide whether this is the piece you're going to write now? What is it that makes you, like today, the AMC Theaters piece?
Sure.
Why now? What is it? What pulls that trigger for a different topic at any given moment?
As content creators, as what we do full time, like you, we consume a lot of other people's content. And the quintessential Doomberg piece is born from an observation we make that we think is important that the rest of the world has not yet hit upon. So once we have that observation, then we do the next level of digging. Is there a piece here? So will our paying subscribers be interested in learning about this? So the quintessential Doomberg piece teaches you something you didn't know, makes you laugh at least once in a way that isn't silly, and then makes a provocative statement or two without quite edging up to polarization. Those are the sort of the three brand ambitions. We shall teach without being self-indulgent. We shall be funny without being silly, and we will be provocative without being polarizing. Our analysis of our ideal clients is that they'd like to learn, they like to laugh, and they don't want to be talked down to. And so if they can think about something differently, they can laugh once and learn something, we have achieved our brand ambition. So on the AMC piece, it is actually incredibly difficult to quantify the sheer amount of dilution that Adam Aron has subjected his shareholders to because of 2-for-1 split and then a reverse 10-for-1 and apes versus AMC and so on and so on. And so our observation was he has diluted shareholders by a factor of 7. And when he gets his way, he will have the ability to do it by a further factor of 3.8, which means he will have diluted his shareholders from the beginning of COVID to today by a factor of 27. Nobody's ever put that out there in a piece. That's the big insight. That's the aha. So once we have the aha, the learning, then the next thing becomes, what's the opening? How do we entice people? Let's deliver the meat. And how do we close it? And that's a Doomberg piece. So Mission Impossible, we're watching Greta being carried off at this, small hamlet in Germany that's about to be destroyed to make way for the giant earth-eating machines.
Hauled off. It was more like she was posed with getting a hug from the cops. Hey, cops, go stand next to Greta. Okay, yes. So she's standing there smirking like, oh, is this cute? Like,
So with that piece, the insight was, what if she had gotten her way? For all of the flack we've been getting about, hey, the natural gas prices in Europe are down by 80%. Never mind that we were talking about the crisis long before they reached that $100 million BTU apex blow off top. So we decided to write a piece. What if they got their way? What if Germany wasn't burning any coal and had shut down their nuclear power plants? The absurdity of it. And again, we like to write about a wide range of topics. Energy is what we're most known for, probably because we came onto the scene at a time of an energy crisis and had some expertise to add. But we're interested in all kinds of things like the deep sea mining, for example, like you mentioned earlier. A piece we wrote called Sunken Treasure. It's just absurd to us that people would think that you could reach down miles under the sea and scoop up rocks the size of a fist and then ferry them to the shore and process them like we do at any other mine in the world. And then somehow this would be the panacea. And the insight is, in what we call the grift bin, the standard sleight of hand is people will conflate resource base with reserves. And as you know, a resource is nothing more than the amount of material around, and reserves are what is economically viable. And the latter is often a tiny fraction of the former. And so the one sentence summary of a piece is what we spend a lot of time thinking about. So I'll walk you through a Doomberg piece because you're a Substack author and we share this passion. The social preview for our piece, the little one sentence that describes the piece when it goes out, is the first thing that we try to figure out, because that's actually captures the essence of the piece in one sentence. So for today, with the Gong Show piece that we wrote about AMC, the social preview is, if enormous shareholder dilution is good, surely ginormous shareholder dilution is even better. It just shows the absurdity of it, right?
Right.
So
can I interrupt here for just a second?
Yeah,
because when you say that about the social preview, so I met some writers for it's not Babylon Bee. What's the other the other
The Onion?
The Onion, yes.
Yeah.
I met these guys at South by Southwest. It's a long time ago now. And it was at a party, and they introduced themselves. Oh, I said, hey, and then one of the guys, I'd read his article that day, and I forgot what it was, but I was telling her, I said, you wrote that? It was brilliant. Anyway, he said at The Onion, all they do, and when they go into meetings, they write the headlines. And and they find the funniest headlines, and then they write the article. So it's
Correct.
it's like they don't, they're just looking for the gag. And once
Correct.
they have the gag, then they'll write this article to support the gag. And I thought, it never occurred to me before. But anyway, so the social preview comes first. I think the same way. What's the headline? But go, please.
The next is the title.
Yeah.
So I literally have taped on the lamp above my desk in big font, is the title great? So you had a piece that went viral that you published on January 26th. I loved it. And it's a great title. The Billionaires Behind the Gas Bans. And that's the perfect title. Gas bans were hot. Everybody likes to dump on a good billionaire, the hypocrisy,
Right.
yada, yada, yada. So that's great. And that's why your piece went viral. So once we have the social preview, we settle on the title. And we love our title, Sunken Treasure for the deep sea mining. Circling Tether, where Circle is coming out of the dark alleys of stablecoins and Tether is still hiding from the law. Home Cooking, which was the piece we did on gas stoves, or A Home Near You for the piece we did on heat pumps, because like that drove home, like they're coming for your home, Robert. Like it's all fun and games when you're looking at the cities and boy, they're really screwed in the Northeast and California. They're coming for your home now, A Home Near You. That's why we love that title for that piece.
Right.
The next thing we do after we have the social preview and we have the title is the thumbnail for the piece. And the editor-in-chief of Doomberg is a brilliant talent and is the in-house Photoshop expert. And we spend a lot of time on the thumbnail. Why? The thumbnail is what causes people to click.
You gotta have you have to have the right image.
It should tell the story. So if you look at Gong Show, which is the AMC hyperinflation of their dilution of shareholders, I have Adam Aaron's face photoshopped on top of that infamous image from the Weimar hyperinflation of a guy holding Deutschmarks on a wheelbarrow. And we put the chicken in, and the Photoshop is just the right amount of wrong. His face is too big for the body, and the color's off a little bit. And then, and only then, that we have the social preview, the title, and the thumbnail. Do we then write an outline? If we had to write this piece in 10 sentences, what would it be? And we write those sentences out. And then we decide where we're going to cut the free to paid for maximum enticement. And then we write paragraphs around those sentences, and we get our charts and our Photoshops embedded in the piece. We edit it for a full day, 3 solid rounds of editing, and then we publish. And that's how a Doomberg piece is born. So I already have the next one teed up. I'll give you a preview.
Sure.
We're going to write about how the NRC needs to be abolished.
Amen, brother.
Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You've written about this in the past. And we've got a great title. You ready for it?
Bring it.
Nuclear Waste. And we're going to just detail the sheer number of offices that they have and directors and subdirectors. And then we have the bios of all the commissioners. And there's only one that is even tangentially trained in the field of nuclear technology. And all of these people are getting full pensions and benefits and Cadillac healthcare plans. There's 3,200 of them. They've not approved a single nuclear reactor in 40 years. And we're going to close the piece by saying, for a fraction of that cost, Team Doomberg could run the NRC. We'll just say no to everything. And it'll just be the small team that we have, and we'll save the taxpayer a lot of money. So the amount of waste and time and bureaucracy and 12,000 page applications is obscene. And so that's the piece, nuclear waste.
And that NuScale Power just got their reactor approved. I did a short video on this. They spent, it was 6 years, $500 million they had to pay to the NRC. And what was it, 2 million pages of supporting documents, and their application was 12,000 pages.
The NRC exists to shut down the nuclear power industry. Therefore, save all the money and just allow me to say no to everybody. That's going to be basically the piece.
So it's very, well, it sounds, I'll just say it. It sounds formulaic, but if the formula works, you're clearly kicking ass. The formula is giving you you're the top earning. I just looked at it again, the top earning finance publication on Substack. You've grown like kudzu. I was looking at my notes from last May. At that time, you had, 70,000 followers on Twitter, and now you have 200,000? It was just a remarkable, 235,000, but who's counting? No, you had 85,000 then, you have 234,000. Well, let me jump to Twitter then, because we talked about that as well back in May of last year. Why is Twitter important to you? Why is that platform important? And what do you think about Elon Musk and his management there?
So I think Twitter is important to a certain point, and then once you get big enough, you get pretty diminished returns, is our experience. So first of all, Twitter is a pretty toxic place, and we should all admit that it's filled with trolls and all kinds of noise relative to the signal. And we have experienced pretty substantial diminished returns on Twitter. Not sure if it's because of Elon taking it over and the changes that he's made. I understand some of the frustrations with those on the conservative side, with the unfairness with which the prior owners of Twitter handled things, I would counter by saying it's very difficult to truly sort of monitor a social media site. There's all kinds of junk on there. Wouldn't want to do it. Don't envy it. Wish Elon well. I love Twitter. Twitter's been great. The point of Twitter actually is once you sort of get big enough on Twitter, then other people will sort of want to have you on podcasts. And so if we think about the customer journey, so your ideal customer, somebody who follows Robert Bryce, listens to the podcast, heads over to your Substack, and then maybe someday decides to pay you for your Substack if you go paid. That begins with an impression, which Twitter is great at creating. But really, the next generation is an engagement. And then after that, maybe they'll give you their email. And then eventually they'll decide that you're worth paying. They become big fans of yours. Those are your ideal clients. And you want to find as many of those as possible. So in a way, Twitter is a home for pay dirt if you're running a gold mine. So the way we like to think about things is the formula, which we're not ashamed to say we have a formula. People like to read things that are on brand, that are consistent, that achieve our brand objectives. And we've been very open with our audience about our intent to become better at it and to be a professional. And the people who do this very well do have a formula. You sort of think of the journey of that customer experience from impression to engagement to email subscriber to payer. That journey is kind of like your sluice box, right? And you're concentrating your pay dirt to more and more higher purity gold until at the end of the week, you've put enough dirt in the front end, and you roll up the mats and you take it to the gold room and you weigh it and you see how much gold you have. This interaction with you today and your audience is the highest quality form of engagement that a content creator can have. So this is a far superior level of engagement than somebody liking a tweet, retweeting a tweet, or commenting on a tweet.
Because it's in depth and shows the quality of the discussion and the intellect, or whatever.
And they might get to like you, and you might make them laugh, and they might want to support you because they believe the same things you believe. And all of this has to be authentic, of course. Like a lot of content creators have an aversion to marketing themselves because they feel it cheapens the product. I would say it only cheapens the product if the product is cheap. So it only becomes a gimmick if the product isn't any good. So we pride ourselves on producing the very best product we can, which is our pieces. And the market will tell us whether we're right or not. And the way they'll tell us is through our retention and our growth. And like, it's one thing to trick people into paying you. It's another thing to keep them because you're actually creating something good. And if you're creating something good, it's not really a trick. You're just creating something good and offering it for sale, and they can either buy it or they won't. It's the ultimate free market capitalism, which I'm all for. And if our pieces weren't any good, we wouldn't have had the growth that we've had. And so I'm proud of the pieces. I'm biased, of course, because I participate in their creation. So the weakest form of an impression is somebody scrolls on Twitter and they see Robert Bryce's face flash by, and they see that you've published a video, but they just keep scrolling. That's an impression. That's the very front end of the Robert Bryce sales funnel. An engagement might be they like it because they like you and they broadly know what you're up to, and they hit retweet, but they don't listen to the video. But it's still an engagement. The next level of engagement is they stop and they press play on the video and they hear you. You've got the phone in your hand, you're speaking with confidence, square-jawed, handsome American, blah, blah, blah. And they like it, and then they like and they quote retweet it and say, this is a great video. My followers should watch it. And then the highest quality form of engagement is they see you on Chris Kiefer's podcast and they decide, I'm going to go ahead and download that podcast of Decouple and listen to Robert Bryce because I like what this guy has to say. Then they say, oh, Robert Bryce has a Substack. I'm going to head over to robertbryce.substack.com and give this guy my email. Now, you're free right now. They're going to get all kinds of value for that email. And then a time will come, if you so decide, that you want to go behind the paywall in some form. And then the vast majority of those people won't pay you. They'll just take what's free and move on. And that's okay. That's their right. But a portion of them will. And so ultimately, that's the difference between sort of the gold nuggets and the black sand in your pay dirt. And so this creator business is all about generating impressions, engagements, high quality engagements, getting an email, converting to paid. Last thing I'll say is you really want to identify who your ideal clients are and listen to them very, very carefully. There's lots of people who would never sign up to Doomberg or would never be a paid subscriber, and they have all kinds of opinions. And they're interesting, but they're not particularly compelling. When a paid subscriber sends us an email with feedback or a suggestion or a question, we're on it, because our objective is to define, to find, to entice and delight our ideal clients. And by definition, our ideal clients are the people who are willing to pay for our work.
So when you look at those pieces, then I was tracking your work. You're getting hundreds of likes, many in cases hundreds of comments. Or do you know when you've hit that ideal? Are you how close? Or I'll ask it this way: how closely are you looking at those numbers on each piece that you publish?
We are. I'm not.
Okay.
So as a team, we are. But my job is to create the pieces.
Gotcha.
The editor's job is to convert them into great pieces. Our editor also happens to be sort of chief of operations, and that's the person who goes through all of that. And I will look, but the more I look, because you could get sucked into the negativity, the trolls on Twitter.
Sure.
The real prism for me and my sort of daily behavior is, does this help the next piece be the best piece we've ever written? And right. My belief, my strong desire, and is that every piece we publish is now the best piece we've ever written. They might not be. People might not agree. They might like an old piece that we wrote, but we would never publish garbage, right? And so like Gong Show, I'm thrilled by that piece. I've read it. Here's how I know that I've written a great piece. After it's fully edited and loaded, I'll read it 10 times before I hit publish because I like it. And so this is my authentic passion. This is what I was meant to be doing. You can't fake it. It doesn't feel like work. I get to write these Doomberg pieces. And my biggest challenge, to be totally honest with you, is dealing with the comments after I publish a piece.
Yeah.
Because I'm already on to the next one.
Right.
Yeah. And so I can't wait to write.
I have a friend of mine, Jude
waste.
Clementi, he's the editor at Real Clear Energy, and I talked to him about these sometimes. And I said, "Well, so do you look at these numbers?" No, I don't even pay. I'm on to the next thing. I don't want to look at them. And I've had some of the same attitude. I don't want to look at the comments. I don't want that, but I do. Well, so I'll ask you. So, are you writing for yourself, or when I think about when I write, and I've been at this a while, I generally think I'm writing for my late mom. My mother's dead now several years, but I think, who's my target? Who do I want to, I want to make sure she can understand it the first time. Right. And so that's kind of but maybe I'm thinking about the customer who my ultimate Substack payer is wrong. I think my mom might, or she might subscribe, but that's who I generally think about when I'm writing about who am I trying to satisfy, or who would an average reader that doesn't know much about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or,
Sure.
the NGOs behind this climate. Do you have someone in mind, or are you writing for yourself?
Both. So I would never write anything I didn't wholeheartedly believe.
Sure.
And that I didn't. And by the way, first person to admit when I made a mistake, go back and say, oops, that I was wrong on that. Let me write. Like, for example, I was very critical of Circle and their stablecoin USDC. And I've come to believe that they're actually backed dollar for dollar, and that, Allaire has done a good job, and so on. So we wrote that piece like, hey, circling Tether. Like, these guys have convinced me that they're fully backed. But if you only write for yourself, and you are unwilling to do the marketing and so on, then that's a hobby.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Doomberg was never presented as a hobby.
Sure.
Doomberg is a business. It is our intent that Doomberg be the thing we do for a living that feeds our family. We've been very honest about this from the beginning. We will eventually go paid. And when we go paid, we will do this as a profession, and we will put our consulting business on runoff, which we have done. And we are full-time content creators now, doing the work of our lives, writing these Doomberg pieces. If you're going to create a business out of it, it comes with a certain expectation of professionalism. And so we write with our ideal clients in mind. So we've created character sketches of our ideal clients with fake bios and what do they look like. So one of them we've said on other podcasts is a character we developed who doesn't exist, a fellow named Brad. And when we write these pieces and when we edit them, we will ask ourselves, does this delight Brad? Does Brad need to be led all the way to the water, or can we leave a little off and let him draw his own conclusions? Or Jen, or pick your favorite character that we've created. We literally sat around and created these characters and said, does this delight Brad? Does this teach something to Brad, or does Brad already know this?
And how old is Brad, and where does he live, and how much? What does he drive?
Yeah, probably you can imagine. Our demographic: 52. Several cars, including a sports car on the side, 2 country club memberships. No, I'm just kidding. But you get the point. Like, we've created those level of details. We have some young kids out of college who may have been misinformed about, pick your favorite climate change propaganda. I happen to have children of college age. And so it was easy for me to write that character sketch because one of our ideal clients is my son, who I would love I would love if my son read Doomberg more regularly than he does. But it is what it is.
I can't convince my kids to read my stuff either. I don't know this. Hey, Jacob, have you read my piece? Oh, no. Hey, Michael, did you read? Oh, I'm going to do it. I'm like, okay, well, it's not like I'm your dad and I graded every 8th grade paper you ever did and helped you with it.
Let's be clear. Happy to cash the Doomberg check, but not necessarily super interested in reading all the pieces at this stage in their life. And you can't force it, as all parents know. You just sort of have to let them.
Right. Yeah,
but the point is, to your original question, you have to write authentic pieces that you believe in, but it's okay to keep your ideal clients in mind as you do so.
Yeah.
And again, if you want to write, this is where we get a bit of pushback because we are very good at marketing. We take pride in marketing our pieces. We built this business through the prism of what we call the 5 pillars, and demand creation is one of those, as you and I have discussed offline. And we're not ashamed of it. This is America. This is capitalism. And we built this from a couple of keyboards and a standing start on Twitter. We're proud of it. We're proud of the work we've done. And the market is telling us the extent to which we will be successful. And that's the way it should be. If we weren't catching a tiger by the tail, we wouldn't have had this success. And we've done nothing but try our best to help every other content creator who's come our way to share our learnings and so on. And I think that's just a great way to live. And so it is amazing that in 2023, you can create a living online. The barrier to entry is 0, but the barrier to success is very high. Anybody can start a blog. Anybody can start a Substack. Anybody can start a podcast. You've poured your heart and soul into this podcast, and it shows. It's on brand. It's well produced. It's intelligent conversations. It's directed towards your ideal clients, even if you've done so subconsciously. And I would say the pivot towards consciously directing it to your ideal clients is the next level of performance.
Well, this is one of the, so it's just following up on this because this is one of the things, and we have talked about this online or offline, but we talked broadly about it, but you have a lot of experience in business. What makes for a successful brand? Because you've created this brand whole cloth. You've created your ideal client and your ideal paid client, and you've helped other content creators. What makes a successful brand versus one that's not successful?
Yeah, this is a great question and one that we're very passionate about. So what is a brand? A lot of people don't actually know what a brand is. Many people think a brand is a logo or a slogan, a color scheme, a palette, a font. It's none of those things. A brand is nothing more than the gut feeling you induce in your ideal clients when they interact with your product. And when enough of your ideal clients express the same gut feeling, then, and only then can you say you have developed a brand. So our brand is not the green chicken. Our brand is not the name Doomberg. Our brand is not our color scheme or our chart palette or any of those things. Our brand is the gut feeling that we induce in our ideal clients when they interact with our product. And when we started Doomberg from the very beginning, when we created our character sketches of Brad and Jen and my son, we decided what is the gut feeling we wish to induce in those clients? Because you can't actually proactively try to induce it if you don't even know what it is. So the gut feeling we decided that we wanted to induce in our ideal clients is the following. When a Doomberg piece shows up in their inbox, they say to themselves, ooh, I get to read that. Not, I'll probably read that. I'll print it out and see if I get to it. No, I get to read that. And that's a gut feeling. And that's a brand. And we've had many, many subscribers say, I always look forward to seeing your pieces show up in my inbox, usually at 5 a.m. Eastern time is when we publish. And that is a validation of our brand ambition. And the way we decided to do that was the 3 prongs of our brand earlier. We will be funny without being silly. We will be provocative without being polarizing. And we will teach without being self-indulgent. And in our ideal clients, if we could capture all 3 of those in every piece, they will have the feeling of, ooh, I get to read that. So here's a great example. I see, the Power Hungry podcast come out. Ooh, I get to listen to that. I'm going to put that on my podcast, and I'm going to be driving out to the lake this weekend. And I know that the length of the drive is this podcast is going to cover me, and I'm going to learn something new because I love what Robert is doing. Now, as a general rule, ooh, I get to have that product is a great brand. And so but there are other brand ambitions that you might have, when you see a McDonald's French fry, your gut feeling might be, wow, that's a really tasty French fry.
Yeah.
Like that's a brand, right? McDonald's French fries are better than Burger King's French fries. Like, I don't care what anybody says. That's a key element of their brand. And so a brand, most content creators, we wrote a piece all way back when we were still free. It's a great piece. I love it. All of my pieces are like children at this point. The piece was called "These Chairs Aren't Going to Sell Themselves." And it was about brand. And we wrote about the Eames lounge chair, which is sort of the quintessential example of flagship marketing. I don't know if you've ever sat in an Eames lounge chair. But when you do, the gut feeling that is induced in you is, man, this is the perfect piece of furniture. Now, that chair is expensive, but the gut feeling that's induced in you is the people who made this chair are brilliant, and I'm going to buy the furniture I can afford from them because it's an Eames product.
Right.
Right. And they cared very deeply about brand. And in fact, as we said in the
so
piece,
it's another way. Well, I mean, what I hear you, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah,
there's a delight there. I mean, to go back to what you were saying, that there's a delight in that. You see this chair behind me here. Gary Weeks is a furniture maker in Wimberley, Texas, and we have his table, we have his stools.
It pleases you to look at it and to sit in it.
It's incredibly well made.
That's a brand.
It's a delight to sit in the chair. And when I sit in, I think, damn, this, and I don't say that about many chairs, but I like that idea. So the brand, that an ideal brand delivers some kind of delight. Then is that a short way to think about it?
That's a really great way to create a successful brand. There are other ways. You might deliver outrage.
Okay.
And there are lots of people who do great content generating by delivering outrage.
Well, and I think that's some of what motivates me, because I look at, I report on the outrage of, like golden eagles being killed by wind farms.
So do we sometimes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd say we're probably 70% delight, 30% outrage. And we try very hard to make sure that when we express outrage, we're 100% right.
Right.
Because nothing will destroy the brand more than being wrong on something as important as something that you're telling your subscribers they should be outraged about. Again, back to the ideal client, but delighting or outraging or making them laugh. A comedian's brand might be brilliantly funny. Like
but it's touching something deep, that it's something that it's going to affect some reaction from your client, from your. Well, so let's talk about being wrong. Okay. So let me just shift here. So when we talked last, and I interviewed Peter Zion on the podcast as well, and he and several others have talked about this, but in March 26th, you and your piece Farmers on the Brink, you talked about the possibility of famine, and you outlined all the things that were happening. And since then, we've seen, shutdown of a lot of the fertilizer capacity in Europe. I'll cut to, I could read back what you've written there, but were you wrong on famine, or is this a delayed reaction? Are we still going to see food high? We're seeing massive increases in eggs, of course, for right now. We're seeing commodities across the board have gone up dramatically in many cases. Were you wrong on famine, or is this going to happen? What's your take on that now?
When we wrote that piece, it's very important to be authentic. We said the best case scenario, the one we're hoping for, is a year from now, we would look back at that piece and say it was a little alarmist. Because when you're sounding the alarm bell, that the thing you're warning about doesn't materialize is the definition of success. And this is where a lot of content creators in the sort of skeptical side can fall into a trap. Classic example would be if you're a short seller, you end up cheering for negative outcomes. And it's difficult for people who don't know us that well to believe that that was actually what we meant, but we said it at the time. I believe we even wrote about it in the piece. When you're raising the flag to say we have a serious problem here, and then a bunch of interventions happen that abate the worst case scenarios, that's a victory. That's not being, quote, wrong. We were highlighting that a convergence of situations, especially for international farmers and emerging market farmers, was causing serious distress in the food chain. And victory for us would be, as a result of that piece, or other people, maybe somebody else read it and they have some actual power and they do something about it, that the situation would be abated. Now, to your broader question of getting things wrong, we have a disciplined mistake management system. Mistakes will be rare, admitted to, corrected, and learned from. And as long as you have that mindset, and there's no real sort of critical mistake you can make, we again, back to the whole Germany situation, we were warning about heading into the winter, and we said, I remember doing a spaces with Marko Pavic, and he was, saying this was going to be no big deal, and we were saying, I hope you're right, but here's the risk they're taking. And then I said on that space, like, we have thousands of subscribers in Europe, and we don't want any of them to have a hard winter. And if they get through the winter, that would be great. We would celebrate that, and we would love nothing more than to be called an alarmist when we're done. People forget that part of it, of course, and they only remember the pieces where you were raising the alarm, and that's fine. And so I would say that in pockets, we were right. In other areas, the governments around the world have intervened and done Herculean things to take the worst case scenario risks off the board, which we applaud. But it doesn't change the fact that the mistakes were made that put us in that situation. I'll close with a phenomenon in statistics called the expected value. The expected value is the probability of something occurring times the consequence of it. And so, for example, let's take the German winter. The probability of a severe societal impact was high, but the winter has given them reprieve, so it actually didn't happen. You should manage on the expected value, not on the realized value, because eventually the die is not going to turn up in your favor.
Right.
See? And the biggest mistake that the German government can make and Western European leaders can make is to learn all the wrong lessons from a near miss. So again, we come from industry. Root cause and effects analysis of safety incidents is drilled into our DNA. And one of the things we spent almost all of our time on was studying deeply all of our near misses. Wow, this person almost got deeply injured.
Right.
Luckily, they managed to step off the ladder before A, B, and C happened. But if they hadn't, they might have died. What can we learn from that? What we shouldn't learn from that is it's no big deal because they didn't die. Right? And what you should do is internalize the lessons. And so to your original question, we're not afraid to be wrong. We're the first to admit when we're, quote, wrong. And if we're accused of being alarmist because we helped raise the flag of awareness on a certain critical issue before it became a catastrophe, all the better.
Well, and I think some of the points that you made in that piece about high diesel prices, reductions in fertilizer production, all of those are still very much potentially in play, right? And I'm just looking at the graph. I'm in trading economics here. Price of soybeans is double today what it was in early 2000. I haven't looked at the corn market, but I mean, which I think is a good segue into talking about commodities more broadly. And we talked about investing. You're the top earning finance publication on Substack, but you've made it clear you're not an you're not an investor guide or providing investment advice. Are you bullish on ag commodities then? We talked. I asked you about where you were putting your money, and you said our philosophy is threefold. We earn money in fiat, which everyone has to. We earn by buying real assets like gold and land.
We save,
and we invest privately in companies and people that we know. I've had Adam Rosenschwag was on the podcast recently talking about commodities, particularly energy commodities, base metals. What's your view broadly on that? I know this is an investment advice,
sure.
but we've talked about family, we talked about ag commodities. Are you bullish on those? How do you see that investment horizon or the next 5 years, given all the tumult we're seeing in the world?
Broadly speaking, we are bullish energy commodities, and to the extent that ag and metals are, solid embodiments of energy, we would be bullish those as well. Regardless of the daily price swings, natural gas in the U.S. or oil overseas, or pick your favorite, the world is not investing enough capital to produce enough primary energy to maintain the standard of living that most of us are accustomed to. Which means, given the price elasticity demand, that we are structurally bullish energy and physical embodiments of primary energy. Now, you can be smart about it, and we have long said that manufacturing businesses that are energy intense, that are based in North America, that can back integrate into the world's cheapest natural gas, are going to be printing cash if they can sell their products on the global market. So fertilizer producers here are going to do better than fertilizer producers in Europe. Plastic producers on the Gulf Coast are going to do better than plastic producers in Europe or in China, frankly, where
Sure.
they're paying for LNG and coal at market rates. And so, by and large, at the highest level, what would we need to see to say that the primary energy crisis is fully abated. We would need to see the classic signs of overinvestment of capital by the majors. And it's just not there, Robert. Like nobody's
And that was one of the points Rosenzweig said. He said, "This is
yes.
an underloved and underinvested sector." And I mean, I was just looking at some, like one Permian producer. I was looking at it, its price to earnings ratio is less than 8, and it's paying a dividend of 12%.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
it's
look,
like, and they're buying back stock left and right. And Rosenzweig just made some good points about these companies are not going to over drill like they did last time. They saw the shale revolution. They saw that movie before. They're not going to repeat it. They're not going to just go and drill every well they can, because the market isn't going to reward them for more production. And the Biden administration might punish them. So they're going to return cash to shareholders, which to me, I mean, he typified it, I thought, in a very good and succinct way, than ways that I hadn't thought about before. But I asked it because it leads to the next point, which you've written about crypto, you've written about fiat. Is it, you said you save cash. A lot of people are talking about this, but in terms of what makes sense in terms of investment philosophy, we've talked about commodities. Is this sector that just makes the most sense to you, given the debasement of currencies around the world?
So again, we earn in fiat and we save in real assets and we invest privately. Those are the sort of the three ways that we, I'm a big believer.
And gold was one of the ones you mentioned.
Gold, land, productive and otherwise, forest land. We have a small business that we participate in where we buy rural land and harvest some of the lumber and then resuscitate the property and sell it. The real asset, like an acre of land, is an acre of land. They're not making any more of it. Gold is another favorite. And look, we've even talked about at some point at the right price, we could be motivated to park a couple of % of our net worth in something like Bitcoin. In the sense that at least it's an asset that isn't hyperinflating in quantity. It has a limited size, and that's interesting to us. And there's enough people who think it has value that it eventually becomes valuable. But for our investing purposes, we prefer to invest in privately held companies where we know the management team, or our skills and our network and our investment play a role in the success of that company. And in the private markets, it's not for everybody. There's a lot of zeros. We've had a lot of investments that didn't work. And then you have some that pay back 40 times. And it doesn't take too many of the latter to make up for all of the formers, right? And so, but you have to be an accredited investor, as you know, and it's not for everybody. And deal flow matters, and seeing the right deals. And there's lots of hucksters in the space, and you don't have the protections of the SEC and the filings. And then what are you going to sue somebody if they do you wrong? Like it's challenging. It's not for everybody. We have some experience in the space, and it's worked out well for us. But broadly, we look for opportunities where we understand, well, first of all, are they delighting their ideal clients? Like, this is a mindset that works everywhere. Now, if you're a price taker, then you have to look at structural advantages. What's the capital look like, and so on and so on. And what is your competition? What's your location? All of those things.
Gotcha. So let's talk about demographics a little bit, because this is one of the things that I mentioned Peter Zion, and he's been on the podcast, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work. And I'm long-term bullish. I'm very pro the U.S. I think U.S. still is in the best house in a bad neighborhood. We've got favorable demographics, favorable geography, where energy's cheap. We still have the rule of law. But Zion has been talking about both China and Russia now for some time, particularly China, and very bearish on China. Is there, and particularly when it comes to demographics, and Russia's demographics are absolutely terrible, right? High suicide rates, low birth rates. What's your view on this? Because those two countries are so important, both in terms of landmass, in terms of global economics. You've spent a lot of time in China. How do you see those two countries evolving over the next few years, given this rising tension with the West, the U.S. versus Russia, U.S. versus China? How do you see that playing out? And are you bullish China? How do you view China more broadly?
So I enjoy Zihan's work. I consume it. He entertains me, and sometimes he teaches me something. Sometimes I think he is a bit extreme, but a glass house with a rock here. I would say on China's demographics. So first of all, any Western analyst who claims to understand China is probably being a little bold. Right. But I would offer this dimension.
It's an incredibly complex situation there, and I mentioned it before. But that thing where when Hu Jintao is escorted out of, I mentioned it before on the podcast, where Xi Jinping is sitting there and they escort Hu Jintao out in front of everyone. I mean, It was like, wow. I mean, there's an opera playing out
Right out
here,
of the
and
movies.
it's
Yeah.
just some kind of the expressions on their faces and the complexity of what was going on, and how Hu Jintao is looking around like, "You doing this now?" I mean, it was just. I'm sorry, I interrupt, but
No,
yeah,
no. I would just say to Zihan's demographic argument, I think you need to add a certain dimension, which is what is the growth of the middle class in China? So if you're just being an observer and you're just being cold and you're being an analyst, the total number of people probably doesn't matter as much as the total number of people who make it to the middle class, or make it to the cities and work in factories and consume and grow. So you could have the total population of China peak, but the population of the middle class in China still grow for another decade or two. And I think there is a sort of economic dimension to the population, which is an average that maybe some of Zihan's work overlooks. But I would say
that's an interesting point. So you're saying that it's maybe not the total number of people, but it's the total number of people who are coming into an ability
sure.
to consume and to be middle class and productive.
Yeah, produce and all of that stuff,
Yeah,
and get a college
interesting.
degree and
Yeah,
all of these
right.
things.
Yeah.
Now, good. I will just say up front, as I always do when I speak about something that I'm not an expert on, Zihan knows more about demographic trends, and he has forgotten more than I know. So I'm the last person to criticize him in his absence here. I'm not being critical. My experience in China is that there's sort of two Chinas. There's the cities and the rest of the country, and there's, unfortunately, when you have a population that's, I would argue China can't even measure its population accurately. It's like if you've never left Shanghai or Beijing, it's difficult to get an assessment of what's actually going on in China, right?
Right.
When you see these stories of these massive floods and all this other, how many people die, you'll never know. Like, are they even in the system?
Right.
And so it is, my instinct is to be cautious on applying the same sort of parameter across all of the people in China as it pertains to the impact of those population changes on the Western economies, which is what Zihan is trying to articulate.
I got you.
But again, last person to criticize the man. He's got a great flair about him. I enjoy his stuff. Even when I suspect that maybe he's not right, I still consume it, because why not? That's the world we live in.
Yeah. And what about Russia? Because Russia faces a lot of structural challenges. Now we had the embargo on their exports. Some of this is going to affect the diesel market, which you've written about before. Is something that's fascinating to me, because this is the fluid that drives the global economy. And they're in the war with Ukraine. They're throwing more people at it. What's your broad take on Russia, or do you have one?
I would know. I mean, I do. I would lump Russia in with Canada and Australia as large area countries with an enormous amount of resources and relatively small population bases. And it's testimony to the various political infrastructure that they have, that the standard of living, say, in Canada is much higher than it is in Russia.
Right.
And so if you just look on a per capita basis, the average Russian is amongst the wealthiest on the planet, except it's all in the ground and they don't have any claim to it because, their political structure. And so there's the current equilibrium, and then there's the thermodynamic end state. On a per capita basis, Canada, Australia, and Russia should be amongst the wealthiest in the world. And Russia is in that category. Now, they have Vladimir Putin as a leader who is obviously paranoid and worried about being invaded, even though it's 2022, and who's going to be, rolling over the hills to invade Russia. But, that's what he believed. And we gave him all the cards on energy, so he felt emboldened, and he rolled over into Ukraine, which I've been saying all along is a terrible mistake, a miscalculation, a blunder. That the evidence is, I think, pretty incontrovertible on that point. But the world needs his commodities, and that is his trump card, and he's playing it. But ultimately, with the right political leadership and the right contract law and freedom of expression and sort of democratic ideals, there's nothing that stops Russia, demographics or not, from becoming a very wealthy nation. It's politics. And that's the warning shot for here in the US. Like, if we get our politics wrong, we too could see a decrease in our standard of living that the average Russian citizen might be confronting today. And we said a lot, if we could just draw a circle around Canada, the US, and Mexico, what a superpower that would be.
Right.
Like, the NAFTA trading area it's got fertilizer and oil and gas and
And,
coal.
that's one of Zion's points is that, and he
Yes,
thinks he's very bullish on Mexico and U.S.
yes,
Mexico trade. But just to finish the piece on or point on Russia, because to me it's interesting, is that for all of the sanctions and the rest of it, that the U.S.
yeah,
that the uranium, the enriched uranium, HALEU, still coming out of Russia. Their
yes,
oil exports have not declined despite all
right.
the talk about it. So it's just. I mean, it's hard to predict, of course, but I just wanted to get your take on where it is now,
Sure.
because there's so many different levels being played here between the with the conflict, but yet the commodities are still flowing.
Here's what we've learned for highly inelastic commodities like oil, fertilizer, gas, wheat. Sanctions don't work.
Yeah.
They don't work because all a sanction does is embolden a middleman who is willing to break the law.
Right.
And there's no shortage of those. So, a classic example, Saudi Arabia burns a lot of its domestic oil production to create electricity.
Right.
All of a sudden, Saudi Arabia is importing a lot of Russian oil to burn to create electricity and exporting the oil it was otherwise burning to create electricity on the open markets.
Yeah.
The net is that oil is finding its way to the open markets.
Yeah.
You talk about the diesel shortage. India is buying all the Russian oil they can, and their refineries are running full steam. And where's that diesel going? Onto the open markets.
Right.
So ultimately, sanctions on high inelastic commodities add a friction cost that wouldn't otherwise be there. And we've argued from the beginning, like from the earliest of the war, that sanctioning the volume is stupid. We should not be trying to stop Russian commodities from getting to the market. We should be encouraging it, and we should be flooding the market ourselves, because what's going to affect his revenue is price, not volume.
Right.
And in the commodity sector, it doesn't take much of an oversupply to crash prices. We saw minus $37 a barrel oil when COVID was hitting and we had no place to put the stuff, and so on and so on and so on. We should be pumping temporarily to placate the environmentalists, pumping as much as we can and encouraging him to pump as much as he can, because that will crash price and that will impact his revenue. When you're trying to stunt the volume,
or artificially limit the price, which is what the EU has done, right?
Insane.
Oh, you can only sell it for $60.42.
Somehow we think that maritime insurance is the moat, not the inherent energy content and the life-giving standard of living that it gives. Come on, who are we fooling here? But let's go back. Let's take the Greta scenario. What if we had been successful? Yeah. What if we had taken half of Russia's oil exports off the market? What would the price of oil be today? Be $300 a barrel. Right. Put it this way, if we took half of his exports off the market, the price of oil would more than double and he would make more revenue. It can only be that people who have never worked in the commodity sector concocted this foolhardy policy of sanctioning the volume. Right. Like, I've been in the commodities. A 2% supply shortage is a 50% increase in price, which goes straight to your bottom line.
Right.
The converse of that is also true. A 2% oversupply crushes the price. So, in fact, there are entire government regulatory agencies that make sure that you're not colluding to try to put your competitors out of business by flooding the market. It's called dumping, anti-dumping laws. Right. If we want to crush our competitors' revenue, dump. Right. Like, this is all well known, and it boggles the mind that people think that let's do the extreme. We bomb every single oil producing well in Russia today, or shortly after the Ukraine war happened. What happens to the price of oil? Right. $500 a barrel.
Yeah, this would be bad. This would be bad. To go back to Joe Biden, this would be bad for Biden's reelection, reelection possibilities. Well, Doomberg, we've been talking now for just over an hour. In fact, an hour and 8 minutes by my clock here. Just a couple last questions, if you don't mind. So we've covered a lot of issues. We covered a lot of issues when you were on last time. What are the issues, if you look broadly around the world, what are the ones that concern you the most right now? We've talked about food. We've talked about energy. What are there things that are pressing in your mind that concern you the most at the moment?
One of the things that concerns me a lot is the combination of the political polarization of the U.S. and the sort of hyper segmentation of how people consume the news. So we have silos in this country that believe completely orthogonal things based solely on the social media algorithm's desire to maximize dopamine hits, engagement, and outrage. And so I have friends because I kind of live in flyover country, and I have a foot in the sort of rural door, but I have a lot of friends from industry and from the universities that I used to lecture at that are sort of more progressive, and I have family members who only watch CNN or only watch MSNBC or MSNBC or only watch Fox News, and they believe completely orthogonal things.
Right.
And nobody tries to take time to listen to the other side, to listen to coherent arguments and come up with their own conclusions. And I do believe that the U.S. is among the more polarized countries in the world, correcting for the power and influence it has on the global economy. And we're at a very dangerous time. And this actually is probably the issue that scares me even more than energy shortages or food shortages or those types of things.
So it's a market mechanism. So you're worried about the broadly, I guess, to put it, the political risk of political dysfunction in the U.S.
Yes,
would that be a different way to put it?
Yeah, and our society is among the least capable of, look, if you're in Argentina, you're used to hyperinflation. You're used to, governments coming and going. Our society has had really an unblemished several decades of a pretty good time. I mean, we've never had war here outside of the Civil War. We've always had plenty. Yes, there are people who are doing better than others, but to be poor here is different than being poor in most other countries. There's a lot of great things about America. I know that you're pretty patriotic, and so am I. I worry mostly that the manner in which people are consuming information has become so hyperpolarized that we've lost our ability to have an intelligent conversation, a polite debate. We've been criticized for going on certain podcasts where we completely disagree with the podcast host, but our prism is as follows. Are they expressing authentically held beliefs in a polite manner? And if they are, then we'll go on their show. And that's our commitment to the podcast host. We will express our authentically held beliefs in a polite manner. It's okay to disagree with people. And we've lost that in our society, and that bothers me.
Well, that's an interesting way to think about it. I'll just one counterpoint, which is, are we paying just too much attention to Washington? I think about this. Some a Catholic priest told me a long time ago. He said the church isn't Rome. And here in the U.S., we talk a lot about Washington, but Washington isn't America. And I live in Austin. It's a pretty wealthy city, right? But trash still gets picked up here. The local government still works pretty well. The state government still works pretty well. I'm just, it's an observation. I'm not necessarily picking a fight with you on that. It's just
no. I agree.
Are we just paying too much attention to Fox and CNN because they're the media outlets and the media loves to talk about the media? That's what they do, right? But overall, I think for all of those faults, still at the basic government level where I'm touching government, it still works pretty well. Just an observation.
I'd say the problem scales and gets worse from local to county to state to Fed.
Agreed.
And I would say the size of the federal government relative to the GDP continues to grow unabated.
Does the debt concern you?
Yes. I mean, ultimately, it certainly does. I mean, I've heard all kinds of smarter people than me tell me why it's not a big deal. And so far, they've been proven right. I would have guessed long ago that $30 trillion would have been deemed unsustainable and we would be hyperinflating, but I would have been wrong. Because we're the reserve currency and the demand for dollars goes well beyond the U.S. citizens' need for them and yada, yada, yada. I now understand those arguments. I was not prescient enough to have made them a priori. But I will say, as the federal government continues to grow and like I've lived in Chicago, I've lived in Houston, I've lived in Philly, and I've lived in the rural parts of the country, and the chasm is just growing.
Yeah.
Austin is one of these sort of hybrid cities, which still has a foot in both. And it has a lot of its sort of historical culture. Love Austin, love going to Austin. Next time I'm there, we'll have dinner. But the chasm is widening. Like Washington, D.C. is unrecognizable relative to Montana.
Yeah. That's the divide that I see. The one that really concerns me is the urban-rural divide. And that's a political one. It's left-right. It's churchgoers versus non-churchgoers. It's a very much a geographic divide. And it's one I talk about. It's one of the reasons why I care so much about land use and renewables and the fact that these elites and these big NGOs and the big banks and corporations are trying to force these local communities to accept wind and solar projects they don't want. And the locals are fighting back.
Yeah.
But last two things, and my guest, of course, is Doomberg, the famous green chicken, his second appearance on the Power Hungry podcast. You know the last two questions, Doomberg, I always ask them. What are you reading these days? What's on the top of your book pile?
Actually, I'm rereading Thomas Gould's book, The Deep Hot Biosphere.
Oh, yeah,
Not
sure.
if you've
Yeah.
ever read it.
Yeah.
It's always been in the back of my mind as to whether we could write about that book in the form of a Doomberg piece. I think he makes a pretty compelling argument. It probably would be a controversial piece. I don't quite feel comfortable yet writing it, but for those that are unaware, Thomas Gold was a professor at Cornell and a brilliant scientist who had a reputation for entering into fields that weren't his expertise and making provocative hypotheses that turned out to be correct. And the subject of the deep hot biosphere is his hypothesis that oil is in fact not dead dinosaurs, but oil is primordial and oil is abiotic, and that the debris that we see in oil is actually from subsurface life and biology eating methane with loosely held oxygen in the rocks and creating oil as what he would call a renewable resource. And if he is right, it means we have vastly more oil than people think we do. And our whole thinking around the area is dead wrong. It's a controversial book. I find it a very intriguing book. And so that is the book that I'm currently reading, The Deep Hot Biosphere by Thomas Gold. Last thing I'll say about the book, he makes a very interesting observation, which is in our search for life on other planets, it is likely that we have been what he calls surface chauvinistic, because the conditions that appear on the surface that would support life are quite rare. But his hypothesis is the conditions subsurface that would support life are probably pretty prolific. And we could look at planets that we think are dead, but 10, 20, 30 miles below the surface, it might be teeming with life. And so those are the types of books I like to read. I like to be provoked. I don't want to be just fed my biases. And that's a pretty good book.
It's an interesting hypothesis. And my friend Jesse Ausubel, who's been on the podcast, he was a friend with Tommy Gold and talks about that work a lot, and extremophiles. And you can look at some of the oil fields in the world, the Kern field being one example where it should have been exhausted a long time ago, and it hasn't been.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So last question, what gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is that I get up every day and do what I love doing for a living, that we have, in America still, and in the global economy that has developed with the sort of proliferation of the internet and the democratization of content creation. What gives me hope is that even we can create a life where we have an extraordinarily high get to, have to ratio. So what does that mean? We have designed a life where we try our best to only do things that we, quote, get to do. Like, I get to be a guest on your podcast, and when we're done, I get to start writing the next piece because I'm excited about it. I can't wait to write nuclear waste. And I've been able to minimize the amount of have-tos. I don't like doing my taxes, so I can afford to pay an accountant, for example.
Right.
And so in America and in the West in general, we live still in relatively capitalist systems where merit matters. And if you work hard and you play by the rules and you pay your taxes and you do right by the people that come into your life, you too can create a life where your ratio of get to, have to is maximized. Our objective is infinity. We'll never quite reach there, but to the extent that we can asymptotically approach it, life is good. Well,
that's a good place to stop. My guest again has been Doomberg, the world famous green chicken, and purveyor on Substack. You can find him on doomberg.substack.com. You should definitely subscribe. Doomberg, thanks again for coming back on the Power Hungry podcast. Always great fun talking to you.
Same to you, Robert. Have a great rest of your day, and congrats again on your Substack launch, and looking forward to reading your next piece as well.
Awesome. And all of you in podcast land, tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.